Not sure if that's the mic or just me. Okay, well again, thank you for enduring yet another hour of this interesting topic, our father Abraham, looking at how Christians, Jews, and Muslims understand the figure of Abraham. And I'm going to, again, for the benefit of those who weren't here for the early ones, but for the reminder of those who were, just to reiterate the idea, the main theme I'm putting forward, and then how what we've already done plays into what I'm going to talk about today. So again, the conviction that Jews, Christians, and Muslims share three convictions about Abraham. The first is that Abraham's faith developed incrementally, and so I threw in our Walsh logo. It said Deus dat incrementum, God gives this increase to faith. Secondly, all agree on what the stages of Abraham's faith were and their sequence, so the order in which they happened. So it began with Abraham's trust or belief in God, followed by Abraham's performance of covenant or covenant obligations, and then finally Abraham's submission to God's will. And each one of these talks has been devoted to each one of those. Finally, all three religions interpret the significance of each of these stages in similar ways. Not exactly the same way, but in a way that's comparable, that you can gain insight about what's happening with each tradition as it is interpreting Abraham's faith. So to look at the first two of those in brief review, how do Jews, Christians, and Muslims interpret Abraham's trust or belief in God? They all go beyond the explicit text of Genesis, so they all see a deeper significance to Abraham's trusting faith in God than we find revealed in the sacred text. Jews and Muslims explain Abraham's trust as the outcome of a monotheism which he already had, which led to his break with an idolatrous past in Mesopotamia. So you have the story of Abraham before he was called by God, and about why he was chosen by God. It was because he was the first monotheist. None of that in Genesis, but Jews and Muslims freely sort of speculate and develop this idea. Christians look in the opposite direction towards Abraham's faith in God's universal blessing, which Christians understand as a prophetic reference to Jesus. So in a sense, we're all going in different directions away from the sacred text to give new meaning to it. Then last lecture we did, how do we interpret Abraham's performance of the covenant? All view Abrahamic covenant as anticipating a sanctified community, that is, a community of holiness, a community set apart for God for the purpose of worship. And so Jews understand the Abrahamic covenant as anticipating the Sinai covenant, the purpose of which is to make Israel holy as the Lord their God is holy. Christians understand this covenant as anticipating a new covenant, entrance into which confirms the meaning of circumcision for Jews, which is the faith of Abraham, the trust of Abraham. And then for Gentiles, it incorporates them without circumcision. That was Paul's famous solution to that question. How do Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus identify with one another as children of Abraham? And finally, we talked about the Muslim understanding of Abraham as this covenant which is inherited by both Ishmael and Isaac. Right? In the Bible, it's just through Isaac, but in Islam, it is both through both sons. As anticipating the creation of two distinct communities, one in Mecca in Arabia and one on Mount Zion in Israel. And we saw specifically how the tradition in the Quran has Abraham and his son Ishmael rebuilding, restoring the Kaaba, the original place of worshiping God on earth, which is right beneath God's heavenly throne room, and how they rebuild it and how they offer a prayer that God will give them descendants who will submit to God's will. So in a sense, this is an origin story for Muslims, at least the origin of the Arabian Muslims. Well, that theme of submission to God then becomes the focus of today's final talk. This is, of course, the story of the binding of Isaac or the sacrifice of Isaac, depending on which tradition you're looking at. It's referred to differently. Christians and Muslims refer to it as the sacrifice of Isaac. Jews refer to the binding of Isaac, meaning the tying of Isaac's hands in preparation for the sacrifice. We have the biblical version in Genesis 22, which we'll look in greater depth, but the basic starting point is when God says, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, the one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." At the end of this test, then God reveals to Abraham, "Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The Quran also has a telling of this story. It's much more abbreviated, but it is very rich with significance, as we see. And this is the basic beginning of it. It's in Surah 37. Surah is the word for chapter in the Quran. In Surah 37, God recounts the story. He says, "When Abraham's son reached the age of running with him," I'm putting the names in brackets because in the Quran it's just he and his and him, so it can get confusing with all the pronouns. When Abraham's son reached the age of running with him, Abraham said, "My son, I have seen in sleep," that is to say in a vision, that I am to sacrifice you." So what do you think, kid? The son said, "My father, do what you are commanded. You will find me, God willing, to be one of the patient." And then the story unfolds. So notice a couple differences. The son is not named in the Quran. It's not clarified in the Quran who the son is. Also, notice that in the Quran, the son is very explicitly an active participant in the whole process. Again, Jews refer to this as the binding of Isaac because Abraham's not quite sure whether Isaac's going to go through with it. But in the Quran, he is an active participant. So what I want to do is, again, I'll start with the biblical story, look at it in a little more detail, and then we will look at how the three traditions develop and interpret that biblical story. Okay, so we actually have to look at the larger context of Genesis 22, which is the three chapters, Genesis 20, 21, and 22. These three chapters form a narrative unit. They are the first appearance in the Pentateuch of the so-called Elohist source. That is to say, this is a new beginning, a new story, a new version of events which has not been seen before in the Bible. The central theme of this source is the fear of God, which basically means acting in accordance with one's conscience, understood as recognizing God as the source and guarantor of right and wrong. So when Abraham is commanded by God to offer Isaac, this is a question of conscience. Will Abraham recognize who he is in relation to God? Finally, Genesis 20 to 22 introduce this theme by first calling into question whether Abraham does in fact fear God, and then through the stories that they tell, they then demonstrate that he does. So this is it's a new beginning because it actually it raises questions about whether Abraham really is who he says he is, and then proceeds to lead him through a kind of ordeal or series of ordeals that show that he is in fact worthy of this covenant and this promise that God has given to him. So we're going to look at each of these chapters and how they develop this theme of fear. The first chapter, I'll just summarize these, is one of three stories in the book of Genesis where a patriarch passes off a matriarch as his sister. Abraham does it twice with Sarah, and Isaac does it once with Rebekah. It's a type scene, that is to say, it's a stereotypical story that can be retold in various ways, shapes, and forms. In this version, now in the first one actually, that's in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah, who at that time are still Abram and Sarai, go to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. They have to go to Egypt to survive. And Abram says, so that Pharaoh won't kill me because you're so beautiful and he wants you as his wife, tell him that you're my sister so he won't kill me. Thank you. And so she does, but then Pharaoh immediately, or God immediately begins to send plagues down upon Egypt, kind of a pre-enactment of what will happen in the book of Exodus. and Pharaoh figures out what has gone wrong and sends them away rather angrily. It's a very basic story. It focuses on God's reaction to events rather than the internal state of the characters. We're not sure why Abraham does this, why Sarai consents, and why Pharaoh doesn't know this. But in this version of the story, which is a later version, we explore the mindset, the conscience of each of the characters. And the main character is actually the king in question. It's not the Pharaoh. I believe he's a Philistine king named Abimelech. And they go through the same routine. Tell him you're my sister. Abimelech is smitten by Sarah's beauty, takes her into his harem, and thankfully for him, at nighttime, God sends a vision to him, revealing to him that in fact he is about to commit a sin by violating someone else's wife. And God warns him, if you do this, you and all of your people will die. Abimelech protests, I didn't know, I'm innocent. God says, I know you're innocent, that's why I told you. So there's a concern for the king. There's a concern for the other actors involved. So the next morning, Abimelech calls a herd assembly of his ministers and says, we've got to do something about this. And he basically calls Abraham out and he says, what are you thinking? You're jeopardizing the lives of me and my entire people. For what? Why would you do such a thing? And Abraham says, well, I thought there wasn't any fear of God in this place. Oh, and she is also actually my sister. She's my half-sister, so I wasn't lying. Kind of lame. I think that's the point. Abraham, at minimum, misjudged seriously the situation, because Abimelech, in fact, does fear God. He's terrified. He immediately obeys God. Abraham says, I didn't think there was fear of God in this place, but he was wrong. Now, what about the thing about Sarah being his half-sister? Well, the interesting thing is that there's no biblical passage that says that. So that raises a question. Now, there may indeed have been a tradition about this, which was not part of the written Bible. But the point is that we, as the readers of the Bible, we're not sure. We don't know whether Abraham's lying or not. Is this just a cover-up to make him feel better about himself, about what he did to Sarah, and threaten to jeopardize the lives of everyone? Well, she was my sister, so I wasn't lying. It's not my fault. However you read this, it creates some ambiguity for Abraham's character. Up until now, he's been very forthright. He follows God when asked. He circumcises himself and his son when told. He does everything God says, but now, we're not sure. So this establishes the theme of fear of God. We know that they fear God in this place, but does Abraham? He says he does, but he also says Sarah's his sister. Can we trust him? So this then creates the need for further events that will test for us, the readers, and for God ultimately, whether Abraham is really worthy of the promise that has been given to him. Notice also that at the end of the story, says that at the end of what he calls his men, they all greatly feared. Even before we hear fear of God, there's that. Notice also at the end of here, it says, when Sarah is returned, it says that Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. All of these stories about fear involve sons in jeopardy. When people fear God, they bear children. When they don't fear God, their children's lives are at stake. This sequence of stories ends with Abraham's fear of God leading to the survival of his son. So that's a theme that goes together with all these stories. Okay, second story. The expulsion of Ishmael. Ishmael is already growing at this point. He is born before Isaac. We're told that Sarah eventually decides it's time to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael so that there's no question about the inheritance, about who will inherit the family name, who will inherit the family property. So she gets them out of the way, and she says, just send them out into the desert. They'll die. Abraham, we're told, is distressed at this, well, as one might be as a father. But God comes to him in his distress and says, listen to her, do what she tells you to. Don't worry, because I am promising to you that Ishmael will survive. He will be blessed. He will become a great people. He will not die. So what is this? Well, it's a fearful experience, but it's really a test of faith, of trust. Because God has assured him of something, and Abraham trusts God, as he has done in the past. And so he sends them off with a water skin and all that into the desert, trusting God that God will fulfill his promise about Ishmael. And so there's a note about this verb to be distressed. When you conjugate the verb to be distressed, ra'ah, it looks and sounds like the conjugated verb to fear. So we're really talking about fear here, even though it's a different verb. So he sends them away into the wilderness of Beersheba. Beersheba. This is a geographical term that keeps popping up in all these stories. It's the place, the zone where all of this happens, where these fearful tests and fearful experiences happen. We'll learn about it later. We have the story about what happens, right? The water runs out, rather like Abraham with Isaac, one chapter later. The mother, Hagar, is convinced that her son is going to die, and she doesn't want to look upon his death. There's a lot of seeing that goes on in these stories. Just as Abraham sees a ram in the thicket that he sacrifices instead of Isaac later. Anyway, she prays to God. God says, or the angel says, don't fear. There's the fear theme. God has heard the voice of the boy, and he will live, right? He will make a great nation out of him. And so they survive, and they go off and live happily ever after. Later on in the story, you have what seems to be something that is irrelevant to this theme of Abraham's fear, but actually it's entirely relevant to it. We get back to another story of Abraham and Abimelech, who apparently is still not quite sure whether Abraham is bad news, and forces Abraham to swear an oath that he will not endanger his people or his possessions. So Abraham does, and this oath says, swear to me here by God. Abraham says, I swear it. And the place where they swear this oath is called Beersheba, the well of the oath. So Be'er means well and Sheba means oath. So that's where the word comes from. But what does it mean to swear by God? Well, you swear by that which you fear. You swear in the name of that which you fear to transgress. You're not going to go against God. So if you swear an oath by God, then you're not going to transgress that oath. So this whole story of Abraham swearing an oath to God is really implicitly saying, Abraham, we already know from the previous story that Abraham trusts God because he sends his son off into a waterless wilderness. But now he implicitly is claiming, I fear God. Verbally, he's talking the talk. He says, I do fear God. Then comes Genesis 22, the key scene. Let's look at it in bits. First thing we notice is that the beginning of this is really a recapitulation, a retelling of the very first encounter between Abraham and God in Genesis 11, or Genesis 12. Back then, it says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I'll make a great nation. Move to Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land that I shall show you. Same verb, same command, different content, obviously, but it is a conscious reiteration that we are, in a sense, back at ground zero. We're starting the relationship. We're going to test the relationship that began back in chapter 12, that journey of faith. We're going to see whether he can walk the walk. Journey. So they go to this place in the distance that God had shown him. And along with them, they bring two servants. And eventually, Abraham says, okay, you guys can stay here. We'll go on ahead, do the sacrifice, and we'll come back. Now, why does he leave the servants behind, do you think? Because he doesn't want them to see it, because what might they do if they see him raising a knife to his son? They're going to stop him. So he has to keep him away. So he and Isaac are isolated by themselves and walking along. Isaac innocently says, "Where's the lamb?" Abraham says, "God will provide it." It's a wrenching narrative because we really don't know what Abraham's thinking at this point. We hear him, all of his words are double entendres. We're not quite sure, everything has a double meaning here. But they come to this place. He binds Isaac. Apparently, we're not sure whether how big Isaac is at this point, but apparently he's big enough that he needs to be bound in case he struggles. Then we have, just as he is taking the knife to kill his son, the angel of the Lord gives him a call. And I once attended a lecture by John Levinson, the scholar of this story. He said, God calls him on the cell phone, and Abraham says, he's tied up. Anyway, God calls him. He says, here I am. He says, don't lay your hand on the, or maybe he's texting him, don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God. Notice that God is not omniscient in this story. He needs to know that Abraham fears God by his actions. I know that you fear God since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then we have the famous story of Abraham seeing a ram and either getting the clue or exploiting the good fortune and sacrificing the ram instead, which is acceptable apparently. And I skip a bit there. But then there's more. The phone rings again. The angel calls a second time and says, this is what God says. Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves. Now that's just a quote again of Genesis 12. God is reiterating this, but he's now making it, at the beginning and the end, conditional on Abraham's fear. Right? Back in Genesis 12, God just says, come on, follow me, and I'll do this for you. Abraham says, okay. But now, he says, kill him. Kill the son through whom my promise will come about. Well, if he's dead, the promise can't come about. Nevertheless, God does it because he fears God. Abraham does it because he fears God. And God responds, because you have done this, I will do all I said I would. So the terms of the covenant have been transformed from an unconditional one to a conditional one, retroactively based on this action of Abraham. In other words, Abraham's action finally realizes the promise. Okay, lastly, the fun thing. Notice that Abraham returns alone from the mountain. Isaac's not with him, according to, at least it is not explicitly with him. He came back to the young men who he left there, and they returned, as though Isaac really did die. Did he really die? Many of the rabbis, as Rabbi Spencer can tell you, speculated on this. Did he actually sort of go through with the sacrifice? Did he go through with a little? We'll see that when we look at the Jewish elaborations of this tradition, there are even suggestions that he died and was raised from the dead. Anyway, observations. Okay, we already did this thing about that everything becomes a consequence of Abraham's submission to God's command. This sequence that we've been studying from Genesis 12 on to Genesis 22 reveals a holistic understanding of faith that involves all facets of the human person: spiritual, intellectual, physical, and moral. Moral being the most recent one, the consciousness. Does Isaac belong to God or to me? If God demands him. By concluding this sequence with an active conscience, this fear of God, the final version, the received version of the sacred text, underscores the importance of internalized assent. In other words, full cooperation of the human will with God's will is ultimately the definition of faith that comes out of this sequence of stories about Abraham. It's not just trust, it's not fulfilling commands, it's internalized assent to those commands. And the command that he gave him, of course, is different from the command he gave him back in chapter 17 to circumcise himself and his sons. That is if you do this, then that. if you circumcise, then I'll do all that I said I would. When he said, send Ishmael off because I'll protect him, that's an if-then. This story in chapter 22 is not about faith in the sense of trust or belief, because God has given him nothing to trust. There is no assurance of anything in this chapter. He just says, kill him. He doesn't say, kill him if you go through with it, then I'll save him. He doesn't say, if you go through with it, then I'll fulfill my promises to you. He just says, do it. And Abraham does it. Well, he gets as far as God wants him to. So, faith being the full cooperation of human will with God's will. Let's look at how the Quran develops the story in its full capacity here. So again, this is the full pericope, the full passage that is usually associated with the sacrifice of the son. And here's how it goes. It begins by saying, Abraham saying, I'm going to my Lord who will guide me. That was way back 2 weeks ago when we were talking about in Mesopotamia, him leaving his idolatrous culture. Remember, he tried to convince them of monotheism, and even his father rejected him, so he said, peace be upon you, Father, but I have to go. God will guide me. And so he leaves. That's where we are. My Lord will give me, he said, my Lord, give me one of the upright. Give me a righteous son, basically. He's praying for God to give him a son. God says, we brought him the good news of a forbearing son. Notice it doesn't say which son this is, whether it's Isaac or Ishmael. When this son reached the age of running with him, I'm not sure what that means exactly. That's the literal Arabic, running with him. Abraham said, my son, I have seen in sleep that I am to sacrifice you. What do you think? The son said, my father, do what you are commanded. You will find me, God willing, to be one of the patients. So there's no need for deception or concealment of what's going to happen. The son is fully ready to undergo it, and apparently the age of running must be in some kind of maturity. So this is an adult decision that the son makes. Then we hear when they both submitted to God, they submitted their wills to God's will, which again is the etymological meaning of Muslim, one who submits to God's will. And he laid him on his forehead, prepared to sacrifice him. We, God, called out to Abraham, Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. Like this, we reward those who do good. I just say, if we offer people a sign and they submit their wills to that sign, we reward them for it. This was a clear trial, says God, a test. And then God says, we redeemed him, we redeemed the son with a great sacrifice. Presumably this is the tradition of the ram in the thicket. We left him among the later generations. He survived, in other words. Peace be upon Abraham. Like this do we reward those who do good. Abraham was one of our believing servants. We brought him the good news of Isaac, a prophet, one of the upright. We blessed Abraham and Isaac. Of their offspring are those who do good and some who don't do good. So notice that Isaac is mentioned after the story of the sacrifice. But again, it's ambiguous. Is this the son of the sacrifice? So the Quran simply doesn't explicate these matters, which are fully developed in the Bible. These verses in the Quran form part of a lengthy defense of monotheism and righteousness that use Abraham and other prophetic figures as examples. So this is merely one segment, one sort of episode or soundbite of a larger theme. And the passage's ambiguities, what it doesn't say, make it a subject of intense interest and debate among early Muslim exegetes, that is to say interpreters, and traditionists, that is to say people who made it their business to retain a memory of all the traditions of the past and who transmitted those traditions. At issue was not the meaning of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, which is explicitly stated, it's his submission to God's will, but rather the episode's chronological and geographical context, both of which are intimately bound up with the question of which son it was, right? Because in the Islamic tradition, just like in the Bible, there is this, there emerges a basic chronology. Abraham believes in God, Abraham performs God's commands, and then Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son. When did that happen? And where did that happen is the most important question. Did it happen in what Muslim tradition would call Syria, which is to say the Levant, Palestine, or did it happen in Arabia? Now we remember the tradition in the Quran is that Abraham didn't just send Ishmael away, he brought him and his mother to a desolate valley in northwestern Arabia, in the Hijaz, which becomes the valley of Mecca. And it is when she prays, as in the Bible, for water, a spring of water erupts, and that is what Muslims refer to as the Zamzam well, which is a sacred spring in Mecca that is part of the annual pilgrimage that you go to. And there is a famous ritual of running between the two mountains that are there, with the Zamzam well in between, reenacting Hagar's frantic search for water for her dying son. But anyway, the tradition then is that Abraham brought Ishmael there. So if the son of this story is an adult, able to consent to this sacrifice of himself, and if he is Ishmael, this must have happened in Mecca, or thereabouts. Whereas if it is Isaac, it must have happened in Palestine. Right? The geography matters because, the way, as we already know, the tradition about what Abraham and Ishmael do serves as a foundation there, an explanation for what the Kaaba is as a focus of prayer towards God. It's not a pagan site, it's established by Abraham himself. If you go to Mecca, which you can't unless you're a Muslim, you can see the footprints of Abraham there, where he stood. Right? There are all these sort of sacred relics, if you will, of the story of Abraham there. So if this happened in Arabia, then its meaning could be potentially quite different than if it happened before all that. So it's not so much the question of which son it is. Ultimately, theologically, in Islam, it doesn't matter which son it is, because both sons inherit the covenant of Abraham, the covenant of the prophets. Both sons are prophets. So to say it's one or the other is not to, it would not be to rob either son of his role within the history of God's dealings with humanity, but it does have a consequence for how you understand the story about where it takes place and when. So, early Muslim opinion was nearly divided evenly actually between Ishmael or Isaac as the son. One scholar of this tradition has identified 130 votes in favor of Isaac and 133 in favor of Ishmael. That's a lot of different traditions. So in the early tradition, it was very much disputed, and so there's a lot of arguments about the correct interpretation. The pro-Ishmael view ultimately won the day about a century or so later and became the canonical version. This canonical view locates the episode soon after Abraham and Ishmael's rebuilding of the Kaaba in Mecca. So again, after they rebuild the fundamental place of worship to the one God and pray that God will make them and their descendants those who submit to his will, you have a story about how God invites them to submit to his will. So there's a logical connection between these two events in the tradition. So also having established the place of worship, Abraham proceeds to establish the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage cycle which accompanies worship at the Kaaba. And so during the Hajj, Muslims go on a pilgrimage actually all around the region of Mecca nearby and reenact the footsteps of Abraham and Ishmael. And so the story of the sacrifice of the son is associated with one of the stages of this pilgrimage. So just as the Quran treats the Abrahamic covenant as the basis for the foundation of a religious community, the story of Abraham and Ishmael's submission to God establishes the attitude of Ishmael's descendants who will take part in this central ritual. Okay, so it all leads again to a sanctified community, a community shaped by certain rituals which are established by the founders of it. Okay, that's the Muslim development. What about the Jewish development? Something similar to what happens in the Muslim interpretation where you try to relocalize, you try to relocate, in a sense, the tradition to a place that is central to your faith. This same thing happens in the Bible itself. In the book of Chronicles, the land of Moriah comes to be identified with Jerusalem, and the mountain on which the sacrifice takes place comes to be identified with Guess what? The Temple Mount, where sacrifices take place. And so in the developed understanding, and Chronicles was written in perhaps the 5th century or even the 4th century BC, so long after the primary tradition of Genesis came into being, Jews who were rewriting their history in a sense wanted to explicitly associate this foundational act of Abraham's fear as the foundation for sacrifices in the temple. So again, just as in Islam, the actions of Abraham and Ishmael establish the ritual basis of the religion. So too here, Isaac and Abraham's action becomes what makes efficacious, what makes the sacrificial system of the temple effective, because it is all based not on some mechanical notion of magic, it's based on Abraham's fear of God. A further development, early Jewish literature elevates the significance of Isaac's binding further, making the action a prototype of Israel's salvation. So all times when God delivers Israel from danger is modeled after his deliverance of Isaac from death. Both of these developments are also foundational to the Christian understanding of Jesus. So when we reflect then on the Christian development of this tradition, we'll see that very little of it is original. That's to say, it's not an invention of the apostles or a Christian innovation. It's a Jewish tradition into which Jesus' story is slotted. Okay, further development of the tradition. Well, this is more specification of what happens in there. Isaac's binding as a pre-enactment of the Passover. The Book of Jubilees, which is a retelling of the Book of Genesis, written about the 2nd century BC, dates the binding of Isaac to is it the 10th day? Actually, it's the 15th day of the first month of the year, which is the day of Passover. So in other words, this tradition is already aligning this event with a significant later event in Israelite history. So that, in effect, it draws attention to the connection between Isaac's survival and Israel's survival in Egypt, and their survival out of Egypt, obviously, right? Which the Passover commemorates. And of course there, it's not just their deliverance from Egypt, it's their deliverance from the destroyer. Right? This demonic force God unleashes upon Egypt to slaughter all the firstborn sons, probably. So again, that theme of the firstborn. The Egyptians lose their firstborn. The Israelites retain theirs because of their performance of this ritual, their fear of God. Right? The two events are assimilated in Jewish tradition. Later Rabbinic tradition speaks even of the blood of Isaac. That itself reveals that connection with the Passover lamb. The blood of the lamb is what is protective of Israel. Now the blood of Isaac, well, who said Isaac bled? Well, that's when you have the rabbinic speculation about, did Abraham maybe cut him a little so that a little blood came out, or did he actually kill him? But anyway, it's an ambiguous idea, but the blood of Isaac becomes associated with the Paschal lamb of Exodus, and therefore it becomes the source of the efficacy of that lamb. The lamb is effective for driving away the destroyer because of Isaac's blood. And for every future deliverance of Israel, God remembers either the blood of Isaac, or he sees the blood of Isaac, or he hears the blowing of the shofar, the ram's horn, symbolizing that substitution sacrifice that Abraham made of the ram in Genesis 22. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. Also, Isaac becomes the agent of redemption. This is presumably where the basis of the Quran's version, where the son is the willing victim. In the martyrdom literature of early Judaism, Isaac becomes the paradigm of the martyr, the one who dies not only as a righteous person, a righteous sufferer, but also one who can even die for his nation, for the future existence of his nation, because if he dies, there will be no nation, right? It's expressed without reference to Isaac in 2nd Maccabees, where the Jews are being martyred for their faith, and this Jewish boy says, "Through me and my brothers, we will bring an end to the wrath of the Almighty that has justly fallen on our whole nation." So Israel has sinned, God has allowed them to be persecuted. The martyrs say, through our deaths, God will, his wrath will be turned aside to mercy. explicitly associated with Isaac in the book of 4th Maccabees, where the martyrs say, "Remember whence you came," exhorting each other to death. "Remember whence you came, and the father by whose hand Isaac would have submitted to being slain for the sake of religion. For his sake also our father Abraham was zealous to sacrifice his son Isaac, the ancestor of our nation. And when Isaac saw his father's hand wielding a knife and was setting upon him, he did not cower." Again, Isaac as the martyr, the willing victim for his people and for religion, for fear of God. Okay, finally, the Christian development. At first glance, we don't hear a lot of explicit references to Genesis 22. In the New Testament, when we do, it's a fairly conventional retelling of what the Bible says about Abraham's fear of God. But there's a more subtle undercurrent that is actually more significant for understanding the whole Christian reading of Jesus. Firstly, if you remember first off, does Jesus carry his cross to his own crucifixion? Someone says no. Someone carries it for him. But there's another version. So in 3 Gospels, he doesn't carry his own cross, someone carries it for him. In John's Gospel, guess what? He carries it. The reason why that I would suggest is that Isaac carries the wood of the sacrifice. This is the Christian tradition reading of this. Isaac carries the wood of his own sacrifice in the book of Genesis. By having Jesus carry the crossbeam of his own instrument of his death, he is being assimilated to Isaac. Now that might sound far-fetched, but then who is Jesus in John's Gospel? He is the Lamb of God. Well, here we have, "Where is the Lamb, Father?" That's a reference to Genesis 22. He's the beloved Son in all the Gospels, especially the beloved Son in John's Gospel. The beloved Son is Isaac, which leads to the interesting consequence that God has become Abraham as the one who is sacrificing the Son. I've never read any theology that's tried to deal with that issue. But you can see where this is going. In more general terms, already with Paul, the earliest Christian writer, he identifies Christ as our Paschal Lamb in a kind of offhanded way, as though it's already an accepted idea. So even though it doesn't appear in all the Gospels, it appears even before the Gospels. So it clearly was an early Christian way of trying to make sense of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, was by assimilating him to Isaac. Or perhaps Jesus himself, you could say, perhaps identified himself this way, understood his actions in terms of Isaac, which would make sense if he understands his death as a kind of martyrdom, a dying for God. So there's already a tradition, again, in Judaism of martyrdom as dying for God for the redemption of Israel. Guess what? That's how Jesus presents himself and how he is presented by the other homage. So this is all Isaac language. And even beyond that, you could say, well, just as Isaac's survival enables a community to come into existence, because Israel would not exist without Isaac's survival, so too Jesus' survival enables a community to come into existence. My point is that the dynamics of this thinking is the same, both for the Jewish thinking about Isaac and the Christian thinking about Christ. It's very implicit in the New Testament, but it is central. Without Isaac, you don't have the Christian understanding of Jesus. It just wouldn't be there. Or again, it would look very different than it does. So again, another example of how Christians are indebted, not just to the Old Testament, but to the Jewish tradition of interpreting the Old Testament. Right? We already did the Gospels there. Okay, so a couple of concluding observations for the whole thing. So Jewish, Christian, and Muslim interpretation of Abraham's final test all share this fundamental conviction. The success of God's efforts to remold humanity, to bless humanity, is ultimately contingent on humanity's readiness to respond and to collaborate. That's how the story of Abraham's faith culminates, is in that conviction. The beloved community, whether it's Israel, the church, or the Muslim Ummah, can only be born if that response is total, unconditional, and ongoing. So you have 3 different dimensions of that faith which are emphasized in those 3 stories about Abraham that we explored. Finally, to own Abraham as our father is to share his journey of faith at every level, but it also entails recognizing all 3 of these levels in the faith of our brothers and sisters. And so it is in this dialogue, as we come to learn how each of us, each of our communities, understands the story of Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael. We will learn more about ourselves because, as I've been arguing, the dynamics of how we spin those traditions is essentially similar. It's essentially similar. We can learn about a lot from one another about our own tradition this way. So I think I'll end it there and then open it up for questions and comments or thoughts. Yes, please.
All right, now, the Muslims looking at this story, does it bother them at all that the Elohist writer, who had clearly identifies Isaac, was much older tradition? I mean, why aren't they bothered?
Good question. So
by that?
the question is then, how do Muslims, or the Muslim tradition, how does it respond to this acknowledgement that the Torah is the earlier revelation, and that the Torah contains a clear identification of Isaac as the sacrificed son? Well, they weren't bothered by that at first because, as I said, in the earliest interpretive tradition, when Muslims were grappling with, well, what does the Quran mean? They looked precisely to the Jewish sources. As the tradition became more confident, more having a sense of its own identity, a separate identity, it came to look more to internal explanations, that is to say, not to base itself on the Jewish testimony, but to base itself on the testimony that was then emerging about the relationship of Ishmael and Abraham to Mecca and the Hajj, to the pilgrimage. Now there is a sort of there's an unecumenical attitude that this breeds. The unecumenical attitude is the reason why the Bible is different is because the Jews have changed the text. The Jews have distorted the text. And that's why God needs to reveal the Quran. He needs to give the authentic version and meaning of these events. That's the whole idea of the Quran, is God is reminding and correcting the deviations from the one monotheistic faith. And if that leads to say, oh, those, that's kind of not friendly, that those Muslims. Well, guess what? That's how Christians responded to Jewish traditions, too, after a couple centuries of growing as a faith. When the bishops began to want to dissociate the faithful from the Jews, and the development of anti-Semitism, or anti-Judaism, at least the teaching of you have similar arguments. Jews just don't get it. They don't understand their own scriptures. So their traditions about what they mean are bogus. They intentionally deny the references to Jesus. They conceal this under their own tradition. So there's mean-spirited language, but I would argue that what's really at stake, what really explains the Muslim evolution from we're not sure to we are sure, I think has more to do with this dynamic that I've been talking about of as a community develops and as it comes to reflect on its rituals and its sacramental life, its liturgical life, its whole religious life, the traditions will naturally gravitate to explain those rituals, to explain those essential actions of the community that make that community what it is. So I would argue that, sure, there's a lot of finger pointing. That happens. But I don't think that's the essence of why the Islamic tradition looks at it differently. Yeah.
In the Genesis version, God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son. What's the midrash on that?
So the question is, in Genesis, when God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, what does the only son mean? Well, to go back for a moment to the Muslim exegesis, well, it's quite clear. If God is referring to his only son, obviously this is before Isaac was born. Because if Ishmael's alive, then he has two sons. He doesn't have an only son.
Which one is legitimate?
Well, they're both legitimate, says God. They're both legitimate children. They're both blessed by me. They're both formed nations. But let me step back a bit. I see what you want to grab at it here, and I'll give you a couple examples of how this is developed. The very narrative that sequence of stories from Genesis 20 to 22, especially Genesis 21, the function of the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael is precisely to interpret the meaning of your only son. Right? It's precisely to move us in the direction of Isaac as the one. Because Ishmael is now off stage. He's effectively not there. Now, I know that the rabbis will have a more elaborate interpretation of that, that this is Abraham trying to avoid the consequence of God's command. Well, I have two sons. I don't know what you're talking about, God. I don't want to sacrifice any of them. But to give you sort of a historical point here, in the religious background of this idea of the beloved, or not the beloved, the only son, the Yahid in Hebrew. The Yahid is what it is, from the word Echad, meaning one. The Yahid, the only one, it is not an original. It's not an original biblical idea. It's a Canaanite idea. So if you want to understand what Yahid means, you have to look to Canaanite religion, which is sort of embraced and then transformed by the Bible in many ways. The Yahid in the Canaanite tradition, which we know from cuneiform texts and some late Greek testimonies about what Phoenicians believed, because the Phoenicians are the Canaanites, the Yahid is precisely, it's not numerically the only one. It is really just another way of saying the beloved. It's the most precious one. So, if you will, you could say that the only one means the one whom Abraham loves. Of course, he loves both of his sons, right? But he is attached especially to Isaac in this regard, because Isaac is the son of Sarah, through whom he has been promised the salvation of the world, basically, in grander terms. So that, I think, is the historical meaning of the Yahid before it gets to the Bible. In the Bible, it is played upon by the removal of Ishmael from the scene prior to Genesis 22. But then later, the rabbis will have a wonderful story about how Abraham is temporizing here. He's trying to put God off the trail. Your son, well, I have two sons, right? Your only one, well, I have two sons. Isaac, darn it, so that's one of the ways in which that tradition develops, and that gives another example of why Ishmael was a real candidate for it according to early Muslim considerations of this. Yes, sir.
I understood that Canaanites would sacrifice children to Baal for fertile crops and all that. Would sacrificing Isaac been that far afield in Abraham's mind since he was familiar?
So the question is, if Canaanites sacrificed their children to Baal or Moloch or whoever they sacrificed their children to, would God's command to Abraham really have been that far out of left field? Sorry for the noise.
Probably your wife for some milk or something.
Well, it's turned off now. What's
It's
okay.
A couple minutes.
All right, we got a couple minutes still. It would not be out of left field. And there is an apologetic tradition in modern Judaism, I think, in some strands of modern Judaism, I've read this argument, that tries to read the binding of Isaac as a story that explains why child sacrifice is not acceptable to God. But it doesn't wash. It doesn't wash if you read the story. There's actually plenty of places, well, not plenty, there are some significant places in the Bible where Israelites sacrifice their children to Yahweh, and Yahweh does not raise any objections. Jephthah's daughter. He vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of the house. It's his daughter, and we don't have an angel calling him from the sky saying, "Stop!" He just does it. There's also a place even where a non-Israelite, Meshach, king of Moab, who is being attacked by Israel, he sacrifices his son to his deity. And as soon as that happens, the Israelites lose the battle. So there is a presumption among many traditions in the Old Testament that child sacrifice is an acceptable, albeit an extreme, form of dedicating something to God. Now, there are critics of this view, Jeremiah being one critic. There's another, I think Ezekiel says, they sacrificed their children to Baal, which I did not command, which didn't even come into my mind, sort of God being a bit defensive here about it. Well, why would you think that it might come into God's mind, So there is a discomforting reality here, is that there is a presumption of God's ability to demand this, and that's why who am I thinking of? Not Kant, but the guy, the Christian philosopher, Kierkegaard, spun this as sort of the idea that faith is somehow beyond morality. Not so. In the moral universe of the Old Testament, this is precisely what God has a right to claim. And no more so than in the case of Isaac, because Isaac is no normal firstborn. His existence is a result of God's intervention. So the command to Abraham is not just a command that God can make because he's God. It's a more profound challenge. Is Abraham willing to accept that I am the reason that Isaac is there, that I am the reason for everything he has? If he were to withhold Isaac from me, that would indicate that he is going the way of good old sinful humanity, untrusting humanity that I had to deal with for the first 20 generations. That's why I'm trying to get Abraham out of. Right? The whole point of Abraham is to get him out of the whole network of genealogically determined mindsets. And this is the ultimate way he breaks through. He said, will you recognize to whom Isaac truly belongs? Who is Isaac's father, really? Well, you could make arguments one way or the other. He is Abraham's son. But when you get a little further down the line, who is Israel? Israel is my firstborn, says Yahweh. Let him go to the Pharaoh. How can God make that paternal claim unless he has already established, he has staked out that paternal claim upon Isaac? The other reason why it's important to embrace and deal and grapple with, rather than sidestep, the horrific language of presumption of child sacrifice, is because if you don't take it seriously, then Christian theology sort of evaporates too. Right? Because God offered his beloved son. That has no inherent meaning to it unless the binding of Isaac really is what it says it is, unless God really is testing Abraham here. Right? Now that doesn't mean it's the same story, because obviously God is now in the position of Abraham. He's not proving anything to Abraham, but he may be demonstrating something to humanity, in the Christian reflection on that. So again, taking Isaac seriously is important for taking the Christian narrative seriously too. Now Abraham is permitted, obviously, to substitute the ram for his son, just as Abraham managed to stave off God's attempt to kill him by circumcising his sons, just as circumcision itself could be understood as a replacement ritual, a substitution ritual, as it is discussed in, among other things, in Exodus 13, I believe. So the whole notion of child sacrifice is ritually displaced. It's transformed into rituals which don't actually kill the children. And even, we have to recognize, even in Canaanite culture, this isn't something you have to do. It's a possibility. If things get so desperate in your kingdom or in your family, if you feel like you are being threatened by a hostile demonic force, you might have to placate that force somehow. But you certainly don't do it willingly. Just as the characters in the Bible don't undertake this task willingly. But it is a structure, it's an assumption that is not removed. It in fact is made central to the whole notion of who Israel is as the descendants of Isaac and who Jesus is. And there again, see, the dynamic is the same. This is why it becomes so important for Ishmael to be the one who submits with his father, because he is the one who founds the whole basis of Muslim worship. Right? If he is not walking the walk, then that worship is not built upon a firm foundation, just as Israel's existence is nothing if it is not built upon the foundation of Abraham's fear. Yeah.
In the Quran, or in the Hadith, when it talks about Ishmael being the real Isaac, does the sacrifice go through with it?
No, there's no tradition in Islam, to my knowledge, of the sacrifice almost really happening or actually going through as the rabbis developed that, played with that idea. In Islam, you actually have something far closer to the conventional modern view of God doesn't want child sacrifice. This really is just a test. But again, the point is the submission. So, but yeah, there's no development of it, to my knowledge, of that. This is, in Islam, God never commands sacrifice of children. That's why Islam is far more modern in its sensibilities than in its sense, our inherited biblical tradition, which again retains and preserves and transforms these earlier traditions, which seem to us to be very troubling sometimes. That's why I like the translation of fear as fear. We can call it reverence if we want, which I suppose it is, but ultimately it is fear. These are fearful experiences that go all the way through. And by the way, just to connect this again, the fear of Abraham with the creation of a community, if we follow the Elohist string, the last clear Elohist text in the Pentateuch is Exodus 20 to 23, which is the covenant code. The final expression of fear of God is in a mode of life, a community's mode of life determined by laws, which laws will be administered by a group of men who fear God. Moses, his father-in-law, comes and says, "You're crazy, Moses, for judging these people. Get a whole group of men who fear God and have them judge the people." So to the very end, fear, which begins with a father's terror at the loss of all that's been promised to him, becomes the very glue that binds together the covenant community in the end. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm really confused. Okay, you're talking about Isaac,
Yes.
and all of a sudden he's ready to kill the son, and then all of a sudden God says, no, don't. Well, God doesn't make mistakes, so he didn't do it too late. So why would Abraham go ahead and even cut his son or kill him and stab him a little bit?
Well,
God has to do it.
Why would that happen? Well, it doesn't happen in the Bible. But when Abraham returns alone, as it were, it suggests that what he has done is equivalent in the eyes of God to truly, because as God says, "You have not withheld your son from me. You have done what I commanded." So it's as though Abraham has done it, but literally he has not. That's what we can maybe deduce from the Bible. But again, the rabbis will ask some interesting questions about this. Are there other dimensions of this act that are in a sense concealed by the text? After all, the written Torah is only half the Torah. The oral tradition is the crucial thing you need to make sense of it. Just as the tradition of the church is the tradition making sense of the Bible, just as the consensus of the Muslim community is the consensus that dictates the proper understanding of the Quran. So when you have the notion that we don't just have a text here, and that the text in its silences is just as significant as what the text says, then there is room for this kind of interpretive development. But yeah, it's not in the text. It's not in the text.
Okay, just one more thing. Okay, so we have Jesus, the Paschal Lamb,
Right.
who died on the cross. He shed his blood, and that's supposed to be like Isaac
Blood of
supposed to
Isaac.
be like the foreshadowing of this. But if he didn't really bleed, then who's he foreshadowing what about? I mean, I thought that was a foreshadowing of our Paschal Lamb, Jesus.
Well, yes, and that's one of the ways that Christians have read it, and as a foreshadowing, a typological preparation for it and all that, which it can be. But my point was that if the Gospels are a bit more profound than that, they're saying rather more than that. They're saying that if you want to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Paschal Lamb who dies for the sins of the world, you can't understand what that means, unless you study what Isaac means for the birth of a community. in the gospel where Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, when he says it's done, he names his disciple, essentially his brother, you're the son of my mother Mary. He creates a new community at that very moment through that act. So that whole dimension is lost if we don't see the comparison with Isaac there. So if you want, you can say it's a foreshadowing, but it's a foreshadowing, again, the Catholic teaching about the relationship between Old and New Testament is that they are mutually interpretive. It's not that the Old Testament is just advertising for the New Testament. It actually dictates the meaning of the New Testament, dictates the meaning of these events in this reciprocal interplay of texts and texts. But I think we're probably at time. So thank you very much for your time. And I hope to see you later.